My daughter stole my story and published it as her own. Hi everyone! Before we get into today's video, I need your help. We've noticed that the channel's reach has been dropping a bit, and one of the best ways you can support us is by subscribing. It's quick, free, and helps us keep bringing you new and interesting stories. Your support means the world to us, and together we can grow this channel. Thank you so much. Now let's get to today's story. I'm writing from a temporary account for obvious reasons, and I've changed some details to protect my anonymity. Writing has always been my sanctuary, my confession booth, my closest friend. For 37 years, I've been filling notebooks with stories, memories, dreams, and the kind of raw truth that can only emerge when you think no one is watching. These weren't just words on paper. They were pieces of my soul, carefully preserved in ink and bound between worn covers. My name is Katherine Mills, and until 6 months ago, I was the only person who knew I was a writer. It started when I was 15, after my mother's death. The grief felt too big for my teenage body to contain, so I began pouring it onto pages, first just fragments, then longer entries, eventually entire stories built around the scaffolding of my pain. Writing became my way of making sense of a world that had suddenly stopped making sense. Over the decades, the notebooks multiplied. I wrote about my father's struggle with alcoholism, about putting myself through college while working 3 jobs, about meeting my husband David in a bookstore cafe where we spent 4 hours arguing about Virginia Woolf. I wrote about the miscarriages before Sarah was born, about the sleepless nights when she was colicky, about the way motherhood cracked me open and remade me into someone I barely recognized. By the time Sarah reached high school, I had filled 43 notebooks with stories, observations, character sketches, and half-finished novels. They lived in a cedar chest in my bedroom closet, organized chronologically and wrapped in tissue paper to protect them from time and curious eyes. The chest had belonged to my grandmother, and it seemed fitting that it should house these intimate recordings of a life lived quietly but deeply. I never showed these writings to anyone, not even David. They were too personal, too revealing. In these pages, I had confessed fears and desires I couldn't speak aloud, explored parts of myself I wasn't sure I wanted others to see. The notebooks contained the real Katherine Mills, not the competent wife and mother I presented to the world, but the woman who still cried reading poetry, who sometimes felt suffocated by domesticity, who dreamed of traveling alone to places where no one knew her name. Sarah had always been different from me in temperament. Where I was introspective and private, she was gregarious and performative. From childhood, she had an instinct for the spotlight that both impressed and exhausted me. She was the star of every school play, the president of every club she joined, the kind of person who could command a room's attention simply by walking into it. I was proud of her confidence, even as I sometimes worried about her need for constant validation. Sarah seemed to measure her worth by external recognition, awards, applause, social media likes. She had never understood my contentment with a quiet life, my satisfaction with small pleasures, like a perfectly brewed cup of coffee or an afternoon spent reading in the garden. "Mom, you could be doing so much more," she'd say during her college years, when she was majoring in communications and dreaming of becoming a journalist. "You're so smart, so observant. Why do you waste all that talent on volunteer work and book clubs?" I would smile and change the subject. How could I explain that I was already doing exactly what I wanted, that my notebooks were where I channeled my ambitions, where I explored ideas too complex for casual conversation? After college, Sarah moved to Chicago to work for a digital marketing firm. She was good at her job. She had a natural talent for crafting compelling narratives and understanding what made people want to share stories. But I could tell she was restless. She wanted something bigger, more prestigious. She wanted to be known for something that mattered. During her visits home, she would pace around the house like a caged animal, complaining about her mundane work life and her boring colleagues. She talked constantly about starting a blog, writing a book, finding some way to break into real writing. But whenever she sat down to actually write, She would produce a few paragraphs and then abandon the project, frustrated by how difficult it was to translate the stories in her head onto the page. "I have all these ideas," she'd say, "but I can't seem to make them work. It's like there's something missing, some element I can't figure out." I would nod sympathetically, remembering my own early attempts at writing, the false starts, the crumpled pages, the slow, patient work of learning to trust my own voice. I wanted to encourage her, but I also knew that writing couldn't be rushed or forced. It required a willingness to sit with uncertainty, to explore uncomfortable truths, to revise and revise until something genuine emerged. The turning point came last spring, during one of Sarah's weekend visits. I had been in the garden all morning, and when I came inside, I found her upstairs in my bedroom, sitting on the floor beside the open cedar chest. Notebooks were scattered around her like fallen leaves, their pages fluttering in the breeze from the open window. "Sarah!" I gasped. "What are you doing?" She looked up at me with eyes wide with amazement. "Mom, I was looking for an extra blanket, and I found this. All of this." She gestured to the notebooks surrounding her. I started reading just one page, but then, "Mom, these are incredible." My heart was pounding. The violation felt physical, as if someone had walked in on me undressing. These notebooks contained my most private thoughts, my unguarded moments. They weren't meant to be read by anyone, certainly not by my daughter. "Sarah, those are private," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "Please put them back." But she was already holding one of the earlier notebooks, her fingers tracing the faded ink of entries I had written when she was still in elementary school. "Mom, listen to this," she said, and began reading aloud a passage I had written about watching her sleep when she was 7, about the fierce protectiveness that had surprised me with its intensity. Hearing my words in her voice felt strange and wonderful and terrifying all at once. She read with genuine emotion, understanding the subtext in ways that surprised me. When she finished, there were tears in her eyes. "You wrote all of this?" she asked. I nodded, still trying to process the moment. "Mom, this is a book. This is actually a book." She picked up another notebook, flipping through pages covered with my handwriting. "These stories about your childhood, about Grandma's death, about having me, it's all connected. It's a memoir, a beautiful, heartbreaking memoir." I felt a flutter of something I couldn't quite name. Pride, maybe, or hope. For so many years, I had wondered if my writing was any good, if the stories that felt so important to me would resonate with anyone else. To hear Sarah's enthusiastic response was both validating and terrifying. "I never thought of it that way," I admitted. "You have to publish this," Sarah said firmly. "Mom, you have no idea how good this is. People need to read these stories." The idea seemed impossible. These weren't polished manuscripts. They were raw, unedited reflections written for an audience of one. Many of the entries contained deeply personal details about family members, about David, about Sarah herself. How could I possibly share such intimate material with strangers? "I don't know," I said. "It's all so personal." "That's what makes it powerful," Sarah insisted. "Mom, I've read hundreds of memoirs for work, for book clubs, for pleasure. Most of them are boring or fake feeling. This is the real thing. This is what people are actually looking for when they pick up a memoir." We talked for hours that afternoon. Sarah helped me carefully return the notebooks to their tissue paper wrappings, but I could see the excitement burning in her eyes. She had found something she recognized as valuable, something that could potentially solve her own career frustrations. Over the next few weeks, Sarah called more frequently than usual. She wanted to talk about the notebooks, about specific stories that had stayed with her, about the incredible potential she saw in my writing. She started using phrases like literary goldmine and bestseller material. "You should at least let me type up some of the best entries," she suggested during one call, "just to see how they look on the page. You might be surprised by how ready for publication they already are." I was flattered by her enthusiasm, but something about her persistence made me uncomfortable. The notebooks had been private for so long that the idea of exposing them to the world felt overwhelming. I told Sarah I needed time to think about it. "Of course," she said quickly. "I don't want to pressure you. It's just that I've never been so excited about a piece of writing. You have a real gift, Mom. It would be a shame to keep it hidden forever." During her next visit, Sarah seemed different, more focused, more purposeful. She spent hours in her old room with her laptop, claiming she was catching up on work emails. But I noticed she made several trips to my bedroom, always with some innocent excuse, looking for a phone charger, checking if she'd left a sweater in the closet. I didn't think much of it at the time. Sarah had always been curious and energetic, the type of person who couldn't sit still for long. If she was sneaking extra looks at my notebooks, I assumed it was just continued fascination with discovering this hidden aspect of her mother's life. After she returned to Chicago, our phone conversations took on a different quality. Sarah asked detailed questions about my childhood, about specific events I had written about in the notebooks. She wanted to know more about my mother's illness, about my father's drinking, about the early years of my marriage. "I'm just trying to understand you better," she explained when I commented on her sudden interest in family history. "Finding those notebooks made me realize how much I don't know about your life before I came along. I was touched by what seemed like genuine curiosity about my experiences." For years, Sarah had shown little interest in anything that had happened before her birth. Her questions made me feel seen in a way I hadn't expected, as if I was finally being recognized as a full person rather than just Mom. The conversations were actually wonderful. I found myself sharing stories I had never told anyone, filling in details that hadn't made it into the notebooks. Sarah was a good listener, asking follow-up questions and responding with real empathy to the more difficult parts of my history. 2 months after Sarah's discovery of the notebooks, I received a text message that changed everything. "Mom, I have some exciting news. Can we talk tonight?" When I called her that evening, she could barely contain her excitement. "I sent some sample chapters to a literary agent," she announced, "and she wants to represent me." "Nah," my stomach dropped. "Sample chapters of what?" "My memoir," Sarah said, as if this should be obvious. "The book I've been working on about growing up in a complicated family, about understanding my mother's generation, about the secrets we keep from each other." The agent said it's some of the most authentic writing she's seen in years. I felt like the air had been sucked out of my lungs. "Sarah, what exactly did you send her?" "Just a few chapters based on our conversations, plus some of the stories you told me about your childhood. Don't worry, I changed names and details to protect people's privacy, but the emotional core is all there. The agent thinks it could be a bestseller." "Based on our conversations," I repeated slowly, "and the stories I told you." "Right. You inspired me, Mom. All those notebooks, all those beautiful stories about your life. They made me realize I had my own story to tell about what it was like growing up as your daughter, trying to understand why you were always so distant and mysterious." The words felt like physical blows. Sarah was describing my most intimate memories as inspiration for her own project, as if my experiences were raw material she could mine for her benefit. Worse, she was framing my privacy as distance and mystery, pathologizing the very quality that had allowed me to write honestly in the first place. "Sarah," I said carefully, "did you use any of the actual words from my notebooks?" There was a pause. I might have borrowed some phrases here and there, but only because they captured things so perfectly. "You should be flattered. Your writing style is incredible." The agent specifically commented on how authentic the voice feels. I hung up the phone and sat in my kitchen for a long time, trying to process what I had just heard. My daughter had taken my stories, my words, my memories, my carefully crafted reflections, and was presenting them as her own work. She had somehow convinced herself that this was collaboration rather than theft, inspiration rather than plagiarism. The next few days passed in a haze of disbelief and grief. I kept replaying our conversation, looking for signs I had missed, moments when I should have been more protective of my work. I thought about calling Sarah back, demanding that she withdraw her submission, but something held me back. She had sounded so happy, so proud of herself. How could I be the person who crushed her dreams? A month later, Sarah called with more news. She had a book deal. A major publisher was offering her a substantial advance for her memoir, tentatively titled The Space Between Us, A Daughter's Journey to Understanding Her Mother. "They want to fast-track publication," she told me breathlessly. "The editor thinks it could be a breakout bestseller." She compared my writing to some of the biggest names in memoir. "I can't believe this is actually happening." I listened to her excitement, with a growing sense of unreality. This was my life story being celebrated, my writing style being praised, my decades of patient craft being rewarded, and I was completely invisible in the narrative. Sarah had become the author of my own experiences. "When can I read the manuscript?" I asked. "Oh, it's still being edited," Sarah said quickly. "I want it to be perfect before I show it to anyone. But don't worry, you're going to love it. It's really a love letter to you, Mom, to our relationship and everything you taught me about resilience and strength." Over the following months, I watched from the sidelines as Sarah's book became a publishing sensation. The publisher launched an aggressive marketing campaign, featuring Sarah on podcasts and morning shows. She was photographed for magazine profiles, invited to literary festivals, hailed as a fresh new voice in memoir writing. The reviews were glowing. Critics praised her unflinching honesty, her lyrical prose, and her mature understanding of family dynamics. One reviewer wrote, "Sarah Mills has an almost supernatural ability to capture the inner life of a complex woman struggling with motherhood, marriage, and identity." Her descriptions of her mother's generation are both sympathetic and insightful, revealing truths about post-war domesticity that feel both universal and deeply personal. Reading these reviews was like being trapped in a nightmare where everyone was praising someone else for achievements that were actually yours. The lyrical prose they admired was language I had crafted over decades. The unflinching honesty they celebrated came from my willingness to examine my own life without flinching. The mature understanding they attributed to Sarah was actually my understanding, developed through years of lived experience and careful reflection. I finally got my hands on a copy of the book 3 weeks before its official publication date, when I found it displayed prominently in the window of my local bookstore. The cover featured a soft focus photograph of a mother and daughter walking away from the camera, their faces turned toward some distant horizon. I bought the book with shaking hands and read it in one sitting that same afternoon. It was devastating and beautiful, and utterly familiar. Sarah had indeed changed names and some identifying details, but the emotional architecture was entirely mine. She had taken my stories about growing up with an alcoholic father and presented them as her grandmother's struggles. My memories of my mother's death became her recollections of a family friend's loss. My reflections on early motherhood were reframed as her observations about watching me become a parent. But the most painful discovery was that she had lifted entire passages directly from my notebooks. Sentences I had labored over, metaphors I had crafted to capture specific feelings, descriptions I had written in moments of pure inspiration, all of it was presented as Sarah's original work. One passage in particular felt like a knife to my heart. In my notebook, I had written, "Grief is not an emotion you get through, but a country you learn to inhabit. Its geography becomes as familiar as your own neighborhood, the sharp peaks of sudden memory, the low valleys where numbness offers temporary shelter, the winding paths that circle back on themselves when you thought you were finally moving forward." In Sarah's book, this became, "I watched my mother navigate grief like someone learning to live in a foreign country." She mapped its geography with careful attention, the sharp peaks of sudden memory, the low valleys where numbness offered temporary shelter, the winding paths that circled back on themselves when she thought she was finally moving forward. She had taken my metaphor, my carefully chosen words, my hard-won insights about loss, and simply reframed them as her external observations of me. It was a masterful theft, technically not plagiarism since she claimed to be describing my behavior rather than claiming my thoughts as her own, but emotionally and creatively, it was a complete violation. Page after page revealed similar appropriations. My voice, my perspective, my understanding of life's complexities, all of it filtered through Sarah's narrative lens and presented as her remarkable empathy and insight. She had become the author of my inner life. The book's success continued to build throughout the fall. Sarah appeared on major television shows, discussing her breakthrough memoir and the writing process that had produced it. She talked eloquently about mining her family history, about the importance of understanding previous generations, about the courage required to write honestly about difficult relationships. "The key," she said during one interview, "is really listening to the people in your life. My mother, for example, is someone who keeps her emotions very close to her chest. But if you pay attention, if you really observe, you can understand so much about her interior world. That's where the best material comes from. Not just the things people say, but the things they don't say." Watching these interviews felt surreal. Sarah was describing my own creative process. The careful attention to detail, the patient observation, the willingness to explore uncomfortable truths, as if she had discovered these techniques independently. She was being praised for qualities that were actually mine, for skills I had developed over decades of dedicated practice. The breaking point came in December, when Sarah won a major literary award for memoir writing. The ceremony was broadcast online, and I watched as my daughter accepted praise for work that was fundamentally mine. In her acceptance speech, she thanked her editor, her agent, her publisher, everyone except the person whose life and words had made the book possible. "Writing this memoir taught me that the stories we tell about ourselves are never just individual narratives," Sarah said from the podium. "They're part of larger generational patterns, ways of understanding how families pass down both love and trauma. I'm grateful to have found my voice as a writer, and I hope this book helps other people find theirs." Her voice as a writer. The phrase echoed in my head long after the ceremony ended. Sarah had found her voice by stealing mine, had launched her career by pillaging my most private reflections. And she seemed to genuinely believe that she deserved the recognition she was receiving. That night, I made my decision. I spent the weekend gathering evidence, photocopying pages from my original notebooks, organizing them chronologically, creating a timeline that showed when each entry had been written. The notebooks themselves provided clear proof of authorship, with consistent handwriting, dated entries, and the kind of authentic detail that could only come from lived experience. On Monday morning, I called a lawyer. "Intellectual property theft," the lawyer explained during our initial consultation, "can be difficult to prove when it involves personal narratives. But in your case, you have exceptional documentation. Handwritten manuscripts with clear dates, original phrasing that was lifted directly, and a paper trail showing when your daughter had access to the material." "What are my options?" I asked. "Several. You could pursue a civil lawsuit for copyright infringement and damages. You could demand that the publisher acknowledge your authorship and redistribute royalties. Or you could go public with the evidence and let the court of public opinion handle it." Each option felt both necessary and devastating. Sarah had built her entire literary career on this book. Exposing the truth would destroy her reputation, potentially end her writing opportunities, certainly damage our relationship beyond repair. But continuing to stay silent felt like allowing a fundamental injustice to persist. I asked for time to consider my choices. That evening, I called Sarah. She was in New York for another media appearance, still riding the wave of her success. "Mom!" she answered cheerfully. "Perfect timing. I just finished the most amazing interview with the Times Book Review. They want to do a feature story about the rise of family memoir. Can you believe it?" "Sarah," I said, "I read your book." There was a pause. Oh, good. What did you think? I think you know what I thought. Another pause, longer this time. When Sarah spoke again, her voice had lost its buoyant tone. Mom, I can explain. Please do. I was inspired by your stories, but I wrote my own book. I told my own truth about growing up in our family, about trying to understand you. Those are my experiences, my perceptions. And the passages you lifted directly from my notebooks? Silence. Sarah, I have the originals. 43 notebooks with dated entries, many of which appear word for word in your book. You didn't just steal my stories, you stole my actual language. I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line. It wasn't supposed to happen this way, she said finally. I started writing about our family, and some of your phrases just fit so perfectly. They captured things better than I could. I thought maybe it was okay because we're family, because I was writing about you anyway. You thought it was okay to steal my work and pass it off as your own? I didn't steal anything. Sarah's voice rose defensively. Those stories are about our family. They belong to all of us. And I did most of the actual writing work, organizing the narrative, creating the structure, making it into a real book instead of just random journal entries. The casualness of her dismissal hit me like a slap. Random journal entries. 37 years of careful craft reduced to random scribbling that she had somehow transformed into real writing. Sarah, I said slowly, I'm going to give you one chance to make this right. You can publicly acknowledge that the book is based on my writings, arrange for me to receive appropriate credit and compensation, and commit to being honest about your process in future interviews. Mom, that's impossible. It would ruin everything. My career, my reputation, my relationship with my publisher. You can't ask me to do that. I'm not asking, I said. I'm telling you what I need to happen for us to resolve this privately. And if I don't, then I'll resolve it publicly. The conversation ended badly, with Sarah accusing me of jealousy and sabotage, and me struggling not to say things that would make reconciliation impossible. But I had given her a choice, and she had made it clear which option she preferred. 3 days later, I called a press conference. I had spent those 3 days preparing meticulously. I organized the evidence, contacted book bloggers and literary journalists, and reached out to the publisher with a detailed explanation of my claims. I wanted to give everyone involved a chance to respond responsibly before the story became public. The press conference took place in the community room of my local library, surrounded by the books that had inspired my lifelong love of reading and writing. I had invited local media, but word had spread through literary circles, and several national outlets sent representatives as well. My name is Katherine Mills, I began, and I am the true author of the memoir The Space Between Us, which was published under my daughter Sarah Mills' name. The room erupted with questions, but I continued with my prepared statement, methodically presenting the evidence I had gathered. I showed photocopied pages from my notebooks alongside corresponding passages from Sarah's book, demonstrated the timeline of when she had gained access to my materials, and explained how specific phrases and entire paragraphs had been transferred from my private writings to her published work. I want to be clear, I said, that this is not a dispute about shared family stories. This is about intellectual property theft. My daughter took my words, my insights, my creative work, and presented them as her own. She has built a career on work that she did not write, and has accepted praise for talents that are not hers. The questions came fast and sharp. How long had I been writing? Why had I kept my work private? What did I hope to accomplish by coming forward? Had I given Sarah permission to use my material? I answered as honestly as I could, explaining the private nature of my notebooks, the violation I felt when I discovered how my work had been used, and my unsuccessful attempt to resolve the matter privately with Sarah. My daughter is a talented person, I said in closing, but she is not the author of this book. I am. And I refuse to remain invisible while someone else receives credit for my life's work. The story exploded across literary media within hours. Memoir Gate began trending on social media, with writers and readers debating questions of authorship, family stories, and intellectual property. Sarah's publisher announced they were reviewing the allegations thoroughly and had postponed her upcoming book tour pending their investigation. Sarah called me that night, sobbing. "How could you do this to me?" she cried. "You've ruined my life. Everything I've worked for is gone." "You did this to yourself, Sarah," I said, though hearing her pain still broke my heart. "You made a choice to build your career on stolen work. I'm just making sure the truth comes out." "But I'm your daughter. How could you humiliate me publicly instead of working this out privately?" "I tried to work it out privately. You refused." "Because you were asking me to destroy my career." "I was asking you to tell the truth about your career." The conversation continued in circles, with Sarah alternating between rage and devastation, and me struggling to maintain my resolve in the face of her distress. Finally, she hung up on me, but not before saying words that I knew would echo between us forever. "I will never forgive you for this. Never." The aftermath was swift and brutal. Within a week, Sarah's publisher had terminated her contract and demanded return of her advance. The literary award she had won was rescinded. Several media outlets published detailed investigations of the plagiarism claims, with experts in handwriting analysis and textual criticism supporting my evidence. Sarah attempted to defend herself through a series of interviews and social media posts, claiming that the collaboration between us had been misunderstood, that family stories naturally overlapped, that the line between inspiration and appropriation was blurrier than critics suggested. But the evidence was overwhelming, and her explanations only made her look more dishonest. The literary community's response was mixed, but largely supportive of my decision to come forward. Many writers shared their own stories of having work stolen or misattributed, praising my courage in fighting for recognition. Others criticized me for destroying my daughter's career, arguing that family loyalty should have outweighed concerns about authorship. 6 months later, I'm still living with the consequences of that choice. Sarah has not spoken to me since our final phone conversation. She moved back to Chicago permanently, and according to mutual friends, she has struggled to find work in publishing or media. Her name has become synonymous with literary fraud, making it nearly impossible for her to rebuild her career in writing. David has been supportive, but struggles with the family division my decision created. "I understand why you did it," he tells me, "but I keep wondering if there might have been another way." Sometimes I wonder the same thing. In quiet moments, I question whether protecting my intellectual property was worth losing my relationship with my daughter. The victory feels hollow when measured against the cost. But then I remember the feeling of invisibility, of watching someone else receive praise for work that came from my heart and mind, and decades of experience. I remember the casual way Sarah dismissed my notebooks as random entries, her assumption that family stories were communal property available for anyone's use. Most importantly, I remember the moment during her acceptance speech when she thanked everyone except the person whose life had made her success possible. In that moment, I realized that staying silent would not preserve our relationship. It would only preserve the lie our relationship had become. 3 weeks ago, I received an unexpected call from an editor at a prestigious literary magazine. She had been following the story and wanted to know if I would be interested in publishing some of my original work, the actual notebook entries that had started this entire controversy. The excerpts that appeared in the media coverage were remarkable, she told me. "I'd love to see what other material you have. I think readers would be very interested in hearing from the real author." I'm considering her offer. For the first time in my life, I'm thinking about sharing my writing intentionally, on my own terms, in my own voice. The idea is terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Yesterday, I took my current notebook, number 44, and wrote about this experience, about the strange journey from private writer to public figure, about the price of both silence and truth. As I wrote, I realized that even this story, the story of having my stories stolen, was becoming part of my ongoing narrative, another chapter in the continuing work of understanding my own life. Sarah may have taken my words, but she could not take my voice. She could steal my past work, but she could not steal my ability to keep writing, to keep exploring, to keep finding meaning in the act of putting words on paper. In the end, that may be the most important thing I learned from this ordeal. The real power of writing lies not in publication or recognition, but in the ongoing relationship between a writer and her work. As long as I keep filling notebooks with honest observations and careful reflections, as long as I keep discovering what I think by discovering what I write, I remain the author of my own experience. The cedar chest still sits in my bedroom closet, but now it holds new possibilities alongside old memories. For the first time in 37 years, I am writing not just for myself, but for readers I have yet to meet. People who might recognize something true in my words, who might find their own stories reflected in mine. Sarah taught me, in the most painful way possible, that family loyalty cannot be built on lies, and that love cannot flourish in the shadow of theft. She also taught me, inadvertently, that my writing was worth fighting for, worth the risk of public exposure, worth the cost of family conflict, worth claiming as my own. I am 62 years old, and I am finally ready to be known as a writer. It took losing my daughter to find my voice, but perhaps that is simply the price of authenticity, the willingness to tell the truth even when the truth is costly. The notebooks continue to fill with words. The story continues to unfold. And somewhere in the space between what was stolen and what remains, I am learning to write my way toward whatever comes next.